Alright, I want to talk about the next section in ecology, and that's evolution and natural selection. So first we should start with a definition of what natural selection is. Now most people have heard of this before. They've taken introductory biology, but it's important to refresh ourselves because it's something that we don't think about every single day, at least not in the way it's thought about in evolutionary biology. So natural selection is the differential success of individuals within the population that results from their interactions with their environment. So what this is saying basically is that there's some difference in the success, and success can be defined as survivability or reproduction, or success in reproduction of some individuals in the population that results from their interactions with their environment. So there's something kind of environmental factor that's causing some individuals to be more successful than others. And natural selection is a product of two conditions, okay? There's two important conditions. That's variation among individuals within the population in some characteristic that results in differences among individuals in their ability to survive and reproduce. So essentially what I just said previously, these variations are occurring, so there's individuals and they have different characteristics, and that characteristic has to be some trait or some characteristic that allows them to increase their ability to survive or increase their ability to reproduce, okay? And the fitness of an individual, which ties in with natural selection and survivability, the fitness of an individual is measured by the proportionate contribution it makes to future generations. So that is, how many times does it reproduce? How many of an individual's genes are passed on to the future generations, okay? So that's the ability of an individual to survive and reproduce, thus passing its genes on to the next generation. So the whole goal, if you believe the evolutionary biology, kind of idea of life, is that the whole point is to survive, to reproduce, and pass our genes on, and that's it. That's the whole point. I mean, if we were to break it down in the simplest terms, we want to survive long enough to reproduce with a mate, and then pass those genes on to future generations, so that our bloodline survives. And then you can go into all different kinds of really interesting psychological concepts like evolutionary psychology, which is an extremely interesting course. And there are three types of selection here to talk about. So there's directional selection, stabilizing selection, and destabilizing selection. And natural selection requires that the trait be heritable. And what I mean by heritable is that it can be passed on from a parent to offspring, okay? So whatever this trait is, whatever this characteristic that helps the person survive and reproduce, or helps the animal survive and reproduce, it has to be able to be passed on from one generation to the next, okay? So it has to be able to be passed on from one generation to the next. And the way that's done is through genes, okay? The units of heredity are genes. They're carried on chromosomes, okay? And we all know what chromosomes are. You know, we have 46 of them altogether. And the alternative forms of genes are called alleles. So those are just common basic Mendelian genetics that we're talking about here. So different forms of a gene are called alleles. Sometimes a person has alleles that are the same. Sometimes they have two different alleles. And individuals that possess like pairs, and that's exactly what I'm going to talk about next. So individuals that possess like pairs of alleles are homozygous. So what I mean by homozygous, and you can see this represented in a lot of Mendelian genetics as something like this. They'll say, well, I have a big A and a big A. So the A represents some gene, right? Some gene that we're trying to study. I don't know, the color of a flower or something like that, or color of a pea plant in the case of Mendel. And if you're homozygous, that means you have two of the same alleles, okay? That's what we're talking about here. So they possess two like pairs. So two big A's and two big A's. So they're homozygous, okay? And this would be called homozygous dominant, and then you could have homozygous recessive, where you would have a little a and a little a, okay, to represent that. And individuals that possess two different alleles are heterozygous. So that's where we get individuals that have, say, big A, little a, okay? So in this case, maybe that person is a carrier for this recessive gene here, and that if this person were to mate with another person who had the same configuration, had the same two alleles, okay, one dominant and one recessive, although this is dominant and this is the expressed gene, when this person mates, there's a 1/4 chance that their offspring is going to inherit this AA, so this homozygous recessive gene, okay? So that's what they're talking about here by homozygous and heterozygous, and this is kind of a way of representing it, visually. And in the case of heterozygotes, the allele that is expressed is dominant, and the one that is not is recessive, and that's exactly what I said. So if the big A is dominant, that's expressed. The little a is not. It's recessive. Okay, the person is a carrier for this gene, okay, for this recessive trait, but they're not expressing it. Although if these two people are to mate, then there's a good possibility, or at least there's some possibility, a 25% chance here, that this person will have an offspring that has a homozygous recessive allele, meaning they're going to show this recessive trait. And sometimes that could be a bad thing, sometimes it could be a good thing, sometimes it doesn't make a difference. Okay? So the sum of heritable information carried by an individual is its genotype. Okay, so a genotype is all the genetic information carried by an individual. Okay, that's all the DNA, basically. And the gene pool, okay, people talk about a gene pool all the time, and that's the total collection of genes across all individuals in a population. So every single person in the population, if we were to look at all the genes, then we would have a gene pool, and from that gene pool we could select certain genes that maybe are detrimental, maybe disease-causing genes, or genes that are dysfunctional in the population, and then we could study those genes and figure out what's going on there and why that's happening. Okay, so the physical expression of a gene on which natural selection acts is known as the phenotype. So phenotype is the expression of the gene. That's once the gene is expressed, then it's usually expressed as a protein. We talk about the development of, the cell produces some kind of protein, and that protein eventually develops into us, into the various different tissues that we have and the various different cells, etc. So what you see expressed, your hair color, for instance, is a phenotype. That's a phenotypic trait. It's expressed and it's shown, and we can see it. And natural selection, which again is the differential success of individuals within the population, that results from interactions with the environment. Those things can be changed depending on the environment. For instance, somebody may develop lighter color skin if they're not in the sun as much. If there were some situation where people lived in a geographic region where they maybe didn't get as much sunlight, then over time those people would develop lighter color skin because they don't have the need for melanin and to protect them from the sun. So that's an example. And the range of phenotypic expression under different environmental conditions is the phenotypic plasticity. So there's some kind of, you can change it. There's expression under different environmental conditions. As the environmental conditions change, so do the expressions of the genes. Okay? So the next thing to talk about is genetic variation. Most inherited variations arise from genetic recombination of genes during sexual reproduction. So it's important to understand that this recombination, happens during sexual reproduction. There are other forms of recombination that occur between bacteria, that are not sexual. Obviously, they're asexual. They usually reproduce by what's called binary fission, but that's not so important. We're talking about genetic variation during sexual reproduction. So that's where most of it comes from. Some genetic material can be altered by mutation. All right, so mutations happen, and they happen spontaneously a lot of times. That is errors in the replication of the DNA. Okay, DNA polymerase III, which replicates DNA, might introduce the wrong base at a certain point. Okay, and what I mean by a base, I mean adenine, thymine, guanine, or cytosine. And it may introduce that base, and then they might have improperly based pairs. Okay, you might have an improper base pairing, and if that occurs and that gets passed on to the next person, that can change the sequence of amino acids, which can change the protein, which can change the shape of the protein, which can change the function of the protein. So you could literally really get messed up by a mutation. Okay. So so what I said here was they're spontaneous, arising from errors during replication, or they can be induced. Okay, and what I mean by induced is that chemical factors or radiate things like radiation, like UV radiation, is actually one of the things that can induce, some mutations. Okay, and in some cases, ionic radiation can even break DNA apart. Okay, so the mutations alter the sequence of nucleotides in some way, and that's what I was saying before. And chromosome mutations alter the structure and number of chromosomes, which could lead to the duplication of entire sets of chromosomes, which are known as polyploidy. Okay, so that's when you have an extra set of chromosomes. That's more common in plants, not as common in, I believe, a lot of our crops, like corn and wheat, are polyploidy. Okay? It's not as common among humans, obviously, and it has quite detrimental effects if it were to be. So let's talk a little bit about evolution now. So the outcome of natural selection is evolution, a change in gene frequency through time. So that's what evolution is. It's a change in gene frequency through time. And speciation by natural selection is a form of evolution. So the process of speciation requires changes in gene frequency of a population that results in reproductive isolation. Okay, if I'm living in one region of the world and suddenly the people that I'm with, this group, we get split into two and we're separated now geographically and we can no longer interbreed with each other, we're going to develop different species. These different species are going to evolve because we're going to be living in different environmental conditions, and the environmental conditions that one group is living in is different from the other group. So that means we're going to have different factors acting on us, different environmental factors acting on us, and different adaptations necessary to survive. So they serve as the exchange of genes with the parent population, the development of new species. So this is how new species actually develop, or one of the ways in which new species can develop. So now I'll move on to the concept of species, okay? A biological species is a group of interbreeding individuals living together in a similar environment in a given region. Okay, so that's all a biological species is, okay? They're just a group of interbreeding individuals living together in a similar environment in a given region, okay? And species may be sympatric, which means just occupy the same area at the same time, or they may have the opportunity to interbreed, or they may be allopatric, which is occupy areas separated by time and space. Okay, so there could be differences there. So speciation, what is this speciation that I'm talking about? So species arise by the interaction of heritable variations by natural selection and the barriers of gene flow between populations. The most widely accepted mechanism, the way most people see this happening, is that speciation is allopatric, or geographic speciation. So I like geographic speciation, I like the word better, it kind of really solidifies what we're talking about here. And that is a single interbreeding population splits into two spatially isolated populations, which diverge into distinct species due to the difference in environmental conditions. That's exactly what I said before. Okay, we have a group of people. Everybody's together initially. Something happens. I don't know, an earthquake happens. I don't know, part of the island that we're living on breaks off and moves away. I mean, anything could happen that would cause a geographic separation. Okay, and that geographic separation now means that we have two different populations living in two different environments, and thus we'll have two different types of environmental factors, or I shouldn't even say two different types, but different environmental factors, several different environmental factors acting on them. So it can also happen though when reproductive isolation precedes differentiation, and the process takes place within the population. Okay, and then we have the sympatric speciation, in which case the most common type is polyploidy. So that's not as important, but it's still worth noting. And then we have geographic variations. So species having a wide geographic distribution often encounter a broader range of environmental conditions. So that makes perfect and intuitive sense. And I think I'm going to cut it here, and I'm going to come back and finish up in the next video.